and welcome to the show. My name is Naeem Sharif, and today we're doing part two of a topic called Prisoner Rehabilitating the Prisons. And today our guest is Mr. Mark Cook. Thank you, Brother Cook, for coming. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just review just a little bit of part one. You talked about how you grew up in Seattle and you were, a family of 10?
Family, 10, right?
10, and you attended school in Seattle.
Yes.
And born and raised in Seattle.
Right.
That is amazing. And you talked about, growing up and you had some very, some really challenging things that you had to go through, and which kind of led you in one particular direction in life. So just tell us, let's just briefly touch on that, just briefly, and we'll go into some other stuff.
Okay, I can pick up where I left off, or I can.
Well, where you left off. Let's go with where you left off.
I was still working with the George Jackson Brigade. Okay. Now, I never really described their makeup.
Let me just ask. So we're talking about prisoners and
these are all prisoners, by the way. Ex-prisoners.
Yeah, ex-prisoners. Okay. All right. So yeah, go. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, these are ex-prisoners in the George Jackson Brigade.
Okay.
Yeah, and we talked about their armed propaganda. Now, one of the things they did was to write a communique. Every time they did an action, they write a communique and send it to the news media.
Okay.
The news media would read it in total, yeah, until finally the FBI got on them and had them stop doing that. But every action they did was in support of an action that was being done by non-militant people on the street, people who were on strike, for instance, as in the prisons, the people who were on strike against car owners, there's kind of a mechanic strikes, things like that. But they wouldn't do anything on their own. They'd always support somebody else. The strikes against City Light, where women were not getting the same pay as men and doing the same type of works, and they were on strike getting nowhere, so we blew up a transformer, gave out the communique explaining why it was done, and it changed things completely around, where women did get the same jobs as men, and
same pay,
same type of work, the types of work they weren't doing before they're doing. Okay, they were using homemade bombs, okay, and they wanted to protect themselves. They didn't have any weapons, if they were vamped on, they didn't have any weapons. It's similar to the Panthers. And I had cash enough from working that I could buy the weapons. So we bought weapons and had our arsenal. And we never carried the weapons around with it until we went on an action. Yeah. Okay, the last action that I was involved in was they were expropriating money from a bank. So I wouldn't have to be given any more money. They'd make their own money. The brigade was made up of men and women, gays and strays. There was whites, blacks, and Native Americans, okay, that were involved, okay. And during one of their expropriations, one member was killed and two others were captured, as John Sherman had Meade. They came to me and said that we had to get them out of jail, break them out of jail. And I was the only one that had any kind of expertise. Some of these were ex-offenders, but they'd never done a bank robbery or burglary, nothing like that. They were check passers or whatever, go along those things. So I showed them how we were going to do it. We cased, one was shot in the face. He had a broken jaw. And so he was going to Harborview Hospital and back to King County Jail. It was a routine. One of the women had visited him and had the routine down. So I was getting a person out of Chicago, out of the Black Panthers in Chicago, to come to Seattle to do this work. He came, but he was, I guess, a cokehead and no good. When the time came, I had to step in and take his place. I knew the whole routine, so I was good. When they brought him out of the hospital to take him back to the jail, I told the guard, I'm taking your prisoner. He looked like he was going for his gun, so I shot him. But prisoners got away. I got away. And a couple of days later, I was picked up by the police, released. Then later on, they picked me up again and kept me in jail. I wanted to go underground, but I could not take my son underground. I didn't have anybody else to take him. But anyways, I was taken in jail, and I was tried for the escape and the bank robbery. This escape, to this day, I admitted to. I am not saying anything about the bank robbery. I was given 30 years by the federal government and 5 years for using a gun during a bank robbery. The state tried me separately and gave me 2 life sentences and 10 years for aiding an escape. Okay, I did all the time for the bank robbery in the federal system. They never give me any. They didn't. I earned all my good time. They didn't give me any extra good time, and they wouldn't parole me. So I came to Washington State to do my time. I had the old conviction, probation violations to do, plus I had 2 life sentences and 10. So I'm doing, what is it, about 250 years and 2 life sentences.
Oh, man.
And I'm just starting, you know.
And you must have felt like Spike Lee in the Malcolm X movie when the character he was playing, when he told him all the time he had to serve.
Yeah, but you know, it didn't really bother me that much. I took an oath when I was in the Panthers, the Ulysses oath, and I don't know if you're familiar with it. It went to, if ever I should break my stride or falter at my comrade's side, this oath shall kill me. If ever my word should prove untrue, should I betray the many or the few, this oath shall kill me. And if ever I withhold my hand or show fear before the hangman, this oath shall kill me. So when I went into prison, I didn't expect to get out of the federal system, let alone the state. And it was just, I've had time piled on me before. People were trying hard to get me out of prison, you know? And they wanted to get me out of federal prison on the streets. But there was also a defense committee for me and Mumia here in Seattle, working to get us both out. Well, they finally did get me out. So, and I got out in about the year 2000. So I spent a little over 24 years in prison at that time. And of course, getting out, I got a job, and again, I got my son back.
Yeah. Wow.
He's in his 30s.
Yeah.
They're all grown up. And so at this point, I want to work with other prisoners who are still inside. I just haven't thrown this away yet, convincing prisoners to help themselves. So my comrade was in San Francisco, and he was editing a newsletter called California Prison Focus. For 14 years, he edited that thing. He got out just before I did, and he was the one that put together the committee to get me out. Had a terrific party when I got to Seattle, by the way.
Okay, I bet.
Even the Seattle Panthers showed up at that one.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, like I said, he's doing this, but he finally moved to Seattle, and prisoners in California, in Pelican Bay, were going on hunger strikes periodically, because they were doing decades in solitary confinement. Some were doing 30 years in solitary confinement.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to figure out some kind of way they could influence people outside, you know, to get things going. Well, Ed and I got involved and helped them with a newsletter called The Rock, where they could communicate with each other.
Okay.
Now, they're in solitary confinement. They can't communicate with anybody else in the main population or in other prisons. So we asked them to send us letters. We'll put them in this newsletter for you. This is called The Rock. Can I put this one up?
Yeah, hold that one up and they'll get it.
This one's called The Rock. And prisoners, they were communicating with other prisoners.
A little bit. Jeez.
Yeah.
There we go.
They're communicating with other prisoners and telling them they wanted to do this hunger strike throughout the prison and to try to get some attention to change things. So we did this newsletter for them.
What was the model? Now, maybe it was for the other newspaper. There was one model called "Working to to extend democracy to all? Was that for the Rock or the other newspaper, the Kite?
It was initially for the Rock.
Okay.
And we carried it on with the Kite. When we
Okay.
because the Rock was for California prisoners and the Kite was for Washington State prisoners.
Okay.
Okay. We did the Rock first. For 3 years, Ed and I poured our money into it. I mean, I spent probably $30,000, and prisoners were spending money to publish this thing and distribute it. It's going to all the prisons down there. They moved prisoners from one prison to another trying to break this thing up, but they carried it on. The people, the so-called shot callers in solitary confinement, sent the word up to the general population and all the jails out there that they were to cease and desist all antagonisms between races and gangs and come together on this thing. And it happened. They did. Murders and stuff just stopped in these prisons. It shocked the prison administration. They thought they did it some kind of way.
Yeah.
Yeah. But eventually, I mean, they had several hunger strikes that they did, and they cut it off because they had people outside saying, we're getting a little action. And they were kind of being sold out. So they started up another one. The final hunger strike they did, there was, I think it was 30,000 prisoners went on work strikes and hunger strikes. And these prisoners, this number was counted by the prison administration, not by inmates.
Okay.
The way they did it, if you missed, I think it was 3 meals or something like that, they'd go and take everything out of your cell.
Oh,
And
wow.
you didn't have no commissary in there to live off of. And they're on a real hunger strike. So that's how they counted all these 30,000 prisoners who went on hunger strike. And they did get some action. It changed the law. But again, this was kind of it wasn't armed propaganda this time. We used these newsletters as a support for actions that the prisoners themselves were taking. Yeah. And the other people, communities in Seattle helped us with this. We had mailing parties and fundraising parties. I inherited kind of a huge amount of money, about $60,000 I spent on these hunger strikes. And also I made a fund for the political prisoners in federal system. When they got out, we'd give them $100 for every year they did in prison. The last person we did it for was Marilyn Buck. She died shortly after she got out, but we got her $15,000 before she passed.
Let me ask you, so when prisoners get out, it's so hard for them to find a job. So it turns out, they always say, well, most of them go back to prison. Tell us about that.
Exactly. It's worse now than it was back then. Because they've given these prisoners what they call LFOs, legal financial obligations. When a defendant is tried, he has to pay for his trial and his attorney, and he has to pay what you call it, victims' fees.
Victim fees, yeah.
And this runs into tens of thousands of dollars. They send them to prison, work them as slave labor, never give them a penny to pay for this big fee. When they come out, they still have to pay these fees. And the system, in a sense, has been designed to keep prisoners going back inside. They even privatize it. So when they go back inside, they didn't have the prisons. So they privatize it. Private prisons are built, and the shares are on the stock market. Yeah, it has got that bad. And so it's evolved now into this thing where the prisoners are trying to be heard. And one of our slogans, we call it at the bottom of every newsletter, communication is a human right. With our constitutions, we like to say that the First Amendment of the Constitution covers that, but it does not. Prisoners don't have the same rights that regular citizens do. They don't have the right to vote, and communication in prison is stifled by administrations, both out of the Capitol and in each individual prison system. They don't want them to speak or write to other people. It's rare for the media to get into prison during a strike to say what's going on. On the East Coast recently, they had all these floods. The East Coast is covered with prisons. They haven't mentioned a word about what happened to those prisoners.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We found out when it was the thing in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
When that flooded, they found out there were prisoners and they were trapped in underwater,
Yeah.
and some of them drowned. But anyways, now what they want to do, they want the right to vote. Now, the right to vote isn't going to hurt anybody. And as far as injury, if you take a case to court, you have to show who is being injured by this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The only people being injured here are the prisoners. If they get the right to vote, it's not going to injure anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And very likely it's going to start a third party.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a divided party,
Mm-hmm.
but it'll be a third party where they can express what they want, pick the people who they want to hold offices so they can change the prison system. So in this last nation strike that's gone on with the kite is they have two major issues they want covered: the right to vote and the right to work for wages.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a lot to do with these financial obligations that are pressed on them. They can't be paid while they're in prison and they're working. And when they get out, they can't get a job because they were a prisoner.
Right.
They're the
Right.
last to be hired.
Right.
So mass incarceration happens.
Let me ask you. There's the Black Prisoner Forum or Unlimited. Tell us about that.
Oh, during that was back in 1969 when I was kind of kidnapped by the blacks to be their first president of the Black United Front.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this was an underground organization again in the prison, and the warden says no underground. In fact, there was an associate warden. We referred to him as Buffalo Head. And Buffalo Head called me into his office and says, you know, we found out about the BUF, and how come other prisoners aren't asking for groups like yours, the Chicanos and the Indians or the whites?
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, he said, well, I'm telling you what I'm going to do. You're going to go to Whole, or you're going to find some people in the population today who will form those groups. Mm-hmm. I didn't have much choice, so I went out in the population. He put me out in the population. I found Pablo Griego. He's a Hispanic. He said, yeah, we'll form a group. And Jim Robidoux, he said, yeah, he's a First Nation Sioux. He said, yeah, we'll form a group. And Big Don Cole said, I'll form a group. He's the head of the Prisoner Advisory Committee. Mm-hmm. And so they formed. Now, we gave it another name. We called it the Black Prisoners Forum Unlimited because the warden didn't want the BFU, which is the Black United Front, came out of Chicago.
Okay.
He didn't want that in his prison.
Right.
And so we just changed the initials kind of around and gave them new words and called it it's a Black Prisoner Forum Unlimited. Mm-hmm. BFU's in there if you look really close.
Gotcha.
Okay. So the prisoners in the Monroe, the reformatory here in Washington State, wanted to form a similar group. They were writing letters to us. And so I had written a letter for this one guy to get closer to his family in Seattle. And he went to Monroe. He was the one writing me about this. And so I set him up the format, how to form the group up there. And they call it the Black Prisoner Caucus. I kind of gave them that because I wanted to get the initials of the Black Panther Party in there. Yeah. Everything I did.
Yeah.
So they call it the Black Prisoner Caucus. And so that exists to this day. When I got out the last time I got out from the federal system, or the federal and state system, I hit the streets. I was hired by the King County Bar Association to sit on the Judicial Screening Committee. And on that, I'm getting things mixed up here.
That's okay.
Okay. I was hired by another group.
Okay.
I'll get to the King County group later on. But I was hired by the Criminal Justice Fund. They were giving funding grants to organizations who could not get grants from other people. Mm-hmm. One of the people applying for the grants was the Black Prisoner Caucus out of Monroe. Okay. Because I'm sitting there and I can vote on who gets it, who doesn't. And when their name came up, I said, well, I can't vote on, I got to recuse myself because I helped form the group. They said, okay. And eventually they got $15,000 from the group. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I continued to work there. When I was talking about the King County Bar Association's Judicial Screening Committee, every judge in King County and the appellate judges get ratings from this committee. Now, when I was paroled from Monroe, there's 3 people on the board. One of them did not want me paroled. Well, I don't have to say what her name is, but
Okay.
the other 2 said, cool. But anyways, 2 out of 3 got me out.
Mm-hmm.
So her name comes up before this committee. And I said, I'm going to have to recuse myself because, you know,
Yeah.
she's the one who didn't want me to get out of prison. I'd be a little biased. They said, all right. And so it came down that they gave her a terrible rating just based on she eventually became a judge pro tem. I don't know. I think she's a judge now. But that's just part of the experience.
Yeah.
But the most surprising thing, the prosecutor who asked for 2 life sentences for me, when I got out, he took me out to dinner.
Really?
And yes, and he gave me his card. I still got it. And he told me that your case was the last one I ever had. And he says, you did not get a fair trial. I didn't know what it was about, what he told him, why he is saying that. But I found out later that the person who, in a sense, rolled over on me, the state's witness, was a client of the attorney who represented me. It was sleeping with her.
Oh.
Yeah, okay. I found out this later from some people who had read that I got out of prison and who my attorneys were. So, but the last support group I did was for using the kite to support the national prison strike. These were prisoners who wanted to do things for themselves. They formed organization inside the prison, and it spread nationally to at least 17 different prisons, 17 different states. And not only did other states pick it up, but the Canadian prisoners picked it up. The prisoners in detention centers picked it up, and they were all doing the strike at the same time. And just coincidentally, there's a prison guards on strike in Georgia during this.
The same time, huh?
1,200 of them, yeah. Interesting, right?
Oh, that was something. So let's hold this.
Hold up, this is the kite
hold
again.
the
This is the
kite.
one where, that really, prisoners wrote to us and wanted us to communicate with other prisons. We just chose these 2 states, Oregon and Washington. But there were other prisoners and other people on the streets who were very supportive of what they're trying to do. And this is their 3rd attempt on a national prison strike, and it grows larger every time it occurs. It got a lot of press coverage, but there was no congressman or legislator who publicly supported their bid for the right to vote.
Oh, that's interesting. I want to go to another subject. Sickle cell. You had sickle cell testing in Walla Walla prison.
Oh yeah. Okay, when we started the program, and it was 1969. Next year it'll be our 50th anniversary.
Okay.
My 50th anniversary.
Gotcha.
Okay. The issue was brought up in the Panther paper. That's where we saw it, that they were doing sickle cell anemia testing, and there was some doctor that worked with the Panthers in Seattle who had devised some kind of device or program to work. And so the Seattle Panthers, my first hookup with the Seattle Panthers, came down to Walla Walla, met with the Walla Walla Panthers, and tested every prisoner who wanted to be tested for sickle cell anemia in Walla Walla. And, I was really glad to hook up with them, but I was mostly glad that it was another project that we were doing something that the government would not do.
Okay, right.
And that's the real purpose of the Panthers across the United States back in the 60s and 70s, and some of them lasted until the 80s, to do for the community what the government would not do. To this day, we have Carolyn Downs in Seattle that's still existing, part of the free clinic that was started by the Panthers. And in other states, the things that the Panthers have done still exist to this day. Got to give us all kudos.
Well, that's outstanding. So one of the things I know when you're talking about your paper was, and what you mentioned is the motto, communication is a human right. And so it sounds like the newspaper was something that that was really needed in the prisons for the people to express themselves and to be able to communicate with themselves.
It's to be understood worldwide. All prisoners have have a right to communicate. Communication is a human right. It covers everybody. It's a shame that one of the things we first lost when they brought Africans to this country was they took away our ancestral tongue. To this day, none of us really know what it was.
Exactly.
And I'm kind of happy to see immigrants come in who still speak the languages. Yeah.
That's so true, so true. One of the things also, free all political prisoners. That was
Okay. I kind of took that serious. I mean, when the shot went out early, before I ever went to prison, that we would free all political prisoners. And when they said we were to free John Sherman, one of our political prisoners, he was white, and there's no color line drawn. I was there, and I did my job, and we all did our job. I was the only one who was convicted, and there was about 6 of us who actually did that.
Did that thing, okay. That thing. Well, just in wrapping up, in closing, what would you like to leave with the audience?
Well, I want to kind of leave with the audience that communication is a human right, and the right to vote is one of those rights. There's no injury to anybody by letting somebody have their say in the political forums. And slavery, the UN says it should be abolished in all forms. In all forms. Yet the United States still insists on having this slavery within our prison systems. And again, the prisoners have the right to speak up and go on prison strikes, labor strikes, to emphasize that they do not want to be slaves. They want to be able to pay for these fines. If they're going to press those fines, they want to be paid for the work they do. So they can pay those fines. Otherwise, they're caught up in this mass incarceration and a revolving door. It's going to grow bigger and bigger. In the state of Washington, the women's population has grown 800% since about 1972. 800%.
Wow.
Okay.
So so we talked about the title of this show, and you named it what? Prisoners, Rehabilitation. So what would you say the title? Prisoners?
Prisoners rehabilitate the prisons.
The prisons.
Yeah. That's what they're trying to do, and they succeeded in part, but they need a lot of help from the outside. If you want to get rid of mass incarceration that's costing the citizens fortunes, in taxes, listen to the prisoners. They have ideas, ain't gonna cost you a penny. Let them vote.
Right, outstanding. Well, Mr. Mark Cook, like I said, I got to call you Mr. Mark Cook and Brother Mark Cook. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing the information. Yes, and for sharing the information and the stories. And we thank our audience for watching. Peace. Thank you very much.